With a Nikon HDSLR camera like this, you have a lot of control over frame rate, resolution, and exposure when you're shooting movies. Let me go over these and explain why they matter. Frame rate is the number of frames being recorded each second and is called frames per second, or FPS for short. Most videos here in the US are recorded in frame rates of either 24 or 30 frames per second. Many productions shot on actual film, such as theatrical movies and commercials, are shot at 24 FPS. They have a nearly imperceptible stutter because your eye is just picking up on the individual frames as they're played back. Videos recorded in 24 FPS also have this slight stutter, which helps give the video a more film-like look. 30 FPS is closer to a standard television frame rate and has a less noticeable stutter to the human eye. Resolution is the size of each frame, stated in pixels. A full high-definition TV frame is 1920 by 1080 pixels, while high definition is 1280 by 720 pixels. These cameras record in both resolutions, and since the 1280 by 720 setting creates a slightly smaller file, it can also record at a higher frame rate, such as 60 frames per second, twice as many frames than 30 frames per second. This setting allows for half-speed slow-motion playback when brought into a video editing program. There are three factors that affect exposure: aperture, your f-stop setting on the lens; ISO, the sensitivity of the image sensor in the camera; and shutter speed. Let me talk about shutter speed first. When a movie is shot at 30 frames per second, for example, each frame is a 1/30th of a second. So the slowest shutter speed you can select on this camera when shooting movies is a 1/30th of a second. 1/30th does allow for a little blur on moving subjects, so I usually double my frame rate to a 60th of a second when shooting 30 FPS, or a 50th of a second if I'm shooting at 24 FPS. This captures the action with just enough blur to give you a sense of perceived motion. But a 1/30th is just the minimum shutter speed. If lighting conditions allow, you can crank up the shutter speed all the way to over 1,000th of a second. This creates another look, though, where each frame has no blur at all, which creates an interesting effect that you've probably seen in high-speed action movies or war films. Aperture is chosen to control the amount of depth of field in your shot, where a larger aperture like f1.4 or 2.8 give you a very shallow depth of field, and smaller apertures like f16 or 22 give you a deeper depth of field. Once you've set your shutter speed and aperture, that leaves a third factor to control to get the right exposure, and that's the ISO. To change the ISO, press the ISO button and use the command dial to select the exact ISO and exposure that you want. Keep in mind, though, that as the ISO gets higher, there will be a slight amount of graininess or noise introduced into the movie.